to the truth or closer to God than them. So that kind of dualistic framework doesn't work for me.
I mean, we're sort of dancing around Islam, aren't we? I mean, in that doubt exists very obviously in Anglican Christianity and Hinduism and Judaism, and the place where doubt doesn't really exist is Islam.
Actually, I do disagree, and I'll try to explain why I disagree, because I think, first of all, I do agree that today, unfortunately, an orthodoxy dominates the mainstream of Islamic religion. However, historically, and even today, when you look at the periphery, heterodoxy always existed. And actually, when you walk around Istanbul, you will come across some Sufi cemeteries. And I'm not trying to romanticize Sufis either, because there might be some Sufis who can be just as hierarchical, just as patriarchal as the mainstream itself. But there's something in the ancient philosophy of heterodox mysticism in Islam that was quite critical, actually, of the orthodoxy. And because of these people throughout the centuries have been silenced, persecuted. When you read people like Rumi, Shams of Tabriz, or Ibn Arabi, there's a reason why their voices have been suppressed, silenced, censored today by the orthodoxy that we're both critical of. So there is an element of doubt. Actually, we have these Bektashi poems in Turkey and across the Middle East, similar narratives as well, questioning the imagery of a transcendental patriarchal God that the orthodoxy created, questioning with humor. That culture is still there, that philosophy is still there, but of course it has been suppressed to a large extent.
I mean, isn't that actually the tragedy of what's going on in Turkey at the moment? That Turkey truly was the bridge between Asia and Europe.
It could have been.
And could have been so much more of a bridge today at a time where it is needed more than ever.
Yeah.
And yet it isn't.
And what a shame that is, because as you so rightly said, it could have been that bridge. Turkey had never a proper democracy, but it wasn't as bad as this. I mean, we've been going backwards. And in that regard, I think Turkey does hold important lessons for progressive-minded people everywhere, because it shows us a few important lessons. One, obviously, that history is not necessarily linear. You know, we tend to think that the future is going to be more developed than today. That is not necessarily the case. Secondly, it shows us that generations can make exactly the same mistakes as their great-grandparents had made, as if the nation is drawing circles. But I think it also shows us...
Just explain that bit, because I'd like to explore that a bit. What do you mean?
Well, these are countries that... in our past, there are so many dark chapters that we can't talk about. Turkey is, even though it has an old, rich history, it's a society of amnesia. You know, we have collective amnesia. That's what we're suffering from. That is why in Turkey it's very difficult to talk about the Armenian genocide. The moment you utter the word, you're labeled as a betrayer. It's very difficult to talk about lots of dark chapters in our history. And yet we must, in order to grow up, in order to face, in order to say, you know, I share the pain, I understand, and hopefully those mistakes, you know, those horrible things will never happen again. Hopefully the future will be better. But in order to say that, we have to have a memory. We have to have a responsibility. So we don't properly learn from history in Turkey. Instead, there's a void. And that void is filled with ultra-nationalistic, very bombastic religious rhetoric about our great Ottoman ancestors, what a great empire we were. This is the popular culture in Turkey at the moment, and of course it's very much backed by the political elite. And we see similar things happening in Hungary, even in Austria. I see the same nostalgia.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. I mean, you know, a lot of people are concerned that Europe is not... You know, people are incredulous that it is possible for Europe not to have the mistakes of history as the first thing it thinks of when it wakes up in the morning. When we all wake up in the morning. And yet, you know, do you think we are at risk of making the same mistake?
Well, it's quite interesting. There are several academic studies that have been conducted recently. I just want to share one of them, which was done by a Harvard professor, Yasha Munk. To me, it's very important because he asked this question, how vital it is for you to live in a democracy, to citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. And what he found out was the importance of age. People above a certain age, people who either had the memory of the Second World War or the aftermath, they, over 70% of them, of that group, said it is incredibly vital for me, it is essential for me to live in a democracy. Under the age of 30, that percentage drops to 25. Only 25% of the millennials said it was very crucial for them to live in a democracy. So memory is important, because when you have the memory of the days of war or the aftermath, when you know what jingoism, ultranationalism, tribalism led, then you appreciate democracy more. I'm not saying democracy is a bed of roses. There are lots of problems, but it is the best political system we as human beings could come up with. We need to improve it, liberal, pluralistic democracy, but to abandon democracy will end up in a catastrophe. My worry is, and this is also happening in the Middle East for different reasons, I hear lots of people, even people who have been educated in the Western world, saying, and I wrote about this in one of my novels, The Three Daughters of Eve, people saying, democracy doesn't suit us. Maybe what we need is a Singapore model. We need a strong leader working with technocrats and good economy, but democracy is not a priority anymore. Human rights is not a priority. Freedom of speech is not a priority. When things come to that point, I think the world will be a much darker place.
Yes, because you do hear people now saying democracy is not such a great thing, even in this country. Talking about people who are too stupid to vote, don't know what they're doing.
Voting is so important. It is so important. We can't brush it aside. But again, coming back to Turkey, I think one important lesson that Turkey has given us is the difference between democracy and majoritarianism. You can have a ballot box, you can have relatively free elections, regular elections, but still that's not enough to render a system a democracy. If there's no rule of law, separation of powers, if there's no free and diverse media, independent academia, if there's no women's rights, LGBT rights, minority rights, without all these components, if you only have the ballot box, or if you only or mostly rely on the election results, that system is not a democracy, it's a majoritarianism. And once majoritarianism settles in, from there into authoritarianism, it's a very short slide, it's a very short step.
How do you go about telling a story in your novels? What's the process for you?
I start with small questions. Like a child, I think we should never lose that curiosity. Why was it like that? What really happened? Most of my stories come to me through images. It's like photographs. I chase those visual moments. But also maybe because I have this academic background, I take my research very seriously. Whether it's a historical novel or a contemporary novel, I read everything I can find on that subject. I immerse myself fully. And then there comes a moment when you stop reading and then you can fly, then you can dream. But for me to be able to dream my story fully and freely, I need to know my subject. And for that, I do a lot of research.
How did you become a storyteller?
I was an only child. I thought my life was terribly boring. And because I moved around a lot, my life was very nomadic in a way. I felt very, very lonely. And so I know it sounds a bit like a cliche, but books really were my friends, and books saved me. They gave me a sense of center that I otherwise lacked. And every time I moved into storyland, I felt more free. To me, it was much more real. If I may share this with you, in my grandmother's house, it was full of superstitions, evil eye beads, coffee cup readings, melting lead. There was a lot of magic in that house. And yet this was a time when outside the window, outside the house in Turkey, bombs were exploding, there were political marches, human rights violations. And I remember as a child, as a teenager, sitting by that window and thinking about this outside world with its political chaos, and my grandmother's world inside the house with its magic and maybe irrationality. And maybe there's a part of me that wants to weave the political and the magical in my stories. I want to bridge those two worlds.
When did